Week 3, 7th chords. I know that you learned 7th chords last year, but in this video I'm going to review what you learned in 191, as well as give you additional information of how we're adapting this for Music 292. Let's get started. First of all, what is a 7th chord? Well, a 7th chord is a chord that stacks an additional note onto the triad to create the interval of a 7th above the root note. So basically, if you think of a triad as being stacked by thirds, you're just adding an extra third on top of that in order to get the extra note. What's new this year is I'm going to give you new vocabulary for talking about the qualities of 7th chords. Quality, you might remember from a previous video, has referred to major, minor, diminished, or augmented, but I'm going to expand this out now with 7th chords. This year, we'll be naming 7th chord qualities according to the quality of the bass triad, in other words, the triad that forms the bottom of the chord, coupled with the quality of the 7th interval that happens from the root to the 7th of the chord. So in our first example, G, B, D, F, if we just look at the bottom triad, G, B, D, we know that that's a major chord. We can then look at the interval from the root to the 7th, from the G to the F, and say, well, that is a minor 7th. So we're going to call this thing a major minor 7th chord. And we're going to use the abbreviation uppercase M, little m to show that. Using the system, we can actually label a whole variety of chords. For example, if we take a look at our second chord, G, B, D, F sharp, it's a major triad on the bottom, major 7th attached onto that, so then we get a major, major 7th. The third example has a minor triad on the bottom, and then a minor 7th from G to F, the root to 7th. That's a minor, minor 7th chord. The fourth example has a diminished triad on the bottom, and then a minor 7th from G to F. This technically, according to our system, should be called a diminished minor chord, but this is more commonly called a half diminished chord because half of the properties are diminished. The triad is diminished, but the 7th interval is not. And then lastly, G, B flat, and D flat, we've got diminished on the bottom, and then G to F flat, that's a diminished 7th. So once again, according to our system, this technically probably should be called diminished 7th, and you do see that in some textbooks, but this is more commonly called fully diminished because both its triad and its 7th are diminished. So we're going to use these abbreviations when we talk about these chords in this class. You might be asking yourself why I'm giving you these abbreviations in the first place. Well, we have a habit of calling the first chord on this page a dominant 7th. But as we're going to discover in both Music 292 and 293, this quality of chord doesn't just occur as a dominant. And so we want a label that's essentially removing that dominant property from the chord. Let's take a look at this in a concrete chord progression. What you're seeing on screen is a progression in F major. Let's have a listen. You learned last year in Music 191 that when you're using 7ths, the 7th of the chord must be prepared and must be resolved. You might have used slightly different terminology last year, but you were taught the voice leading rules for this. Prepared means that we have to move into the note in a very particular kind of way. And our ideal way of preparing a 7th is to prepare by common tone. In other words, keep the note in common with the same voice in the previous chord. So in my example here, you can see that the 7th of my 5-7 chord is the B flat. And you can see that I've kept that B flat from the previous chord in that tenor voice. Sometimes that's not possible, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But before I do that, I want to talk about how to resolve the note. The ideal way of resolving a 7th is to resolve it down by step. And you can see that in my example where I've moved the B flat to an A in the tenor voice. You are, however, going to encounter situations for both the preparation and the resolution where that note maybe doesn't exist in the preceding chord or in the following chord. And so if that's the case, you have to work down my lists here, my list of preparation and my list of resolution that you're seeing on screen. If you can't prepare by common tone, you should try to see if you can prepare by moving the note down by step. If you can't resolve down by step, then see if you can resolve by common tone into the next chord. Here's an example that takes that approach. So this one is also in F major, and once again I've circled the 7th of the 5-7 chord for you. But you notice in this case, I wasn't able to prepare this note by common tone because that B flat didn't actually exist in our previous chord. The chord in our previous bar is a 6th chord, and that's D, F, and A in this key. None of those notes is B flat. So what I need to do is go down my list of how to prepare notes. My next option is down by step. So I ask myself, well, is there a note a step above the B flat that could move down to it? There is not in this chord, so then I move to my third option, preparing up by step. And that one is possible in this situation. I can start on the A, go up by step to my B flat, and then come back to my A to resolve that note. So you need to work down these lists and essentially in the ordering that's given here, according to what chord possibilities that you have on the page. In this course, we're going to talk about using 7th chords according to the type of repertoire that we're looking at. Because the use of 7th chords varies pretty dramatically by era and by musical style. So in the classical period, 7ths are most commonly used on the 5 chord, on the 7 chord, and on the 2 chord. And you may have learned last year in 191 that you could only write 7ths on these chords. This is true of classical style, but as musical styles developed, the rules regarding these 7ths started to change. In the Romantic era, the use of 7th chords expanded to include most diatonic chords except for the tonic chord. The 7th note itself was no longer considered to be quite so dissonant. Furthermore, in 20th and 21st century jazz and pop music, all chords can actually take 7ths. These notes are no longer considered dissonances in the traditional way that we hear them. They're considered something that we can always hear as part of the foundation of the chord. So we don't really have limitations in that regard. When I ask you to work on composition assignments, I'm typically going to specify what time period that I want you to emulate. You can assume that if I don't say otherwise, I want you to write in classical period style. We will have an assignment partway through the course that will specifically be pop music. And in that assignment, I will expect you to use more 7ths than you typically would in the earlier repertoires. That's your review of 7th chords. Thanks for watching. In our next video, we'll talk about added dissonances and how they relate to 7th chords.